Hi guys. For today, our topic will be radio in the Philippines or the history of Philippine radio. Now, the history of Philippine radio is really very interesting. It started with Mrs. Redgrave. Okay? So, the identity of Mrs. Redgrave is really very intriguing because they don't really know or they do not have they cannot really identify who was the first person to broadcast in radio during uh, 1922. Okay, because it was 1922 where radio came into the Philippines during the American period. And Mrs. Redgrave made a test broadcast from the Nichols Air Base using a 5-watt transmitter. So she was the first woman or the first person to broadcast radio transmissions here in the Philippines. Of course, she was an American, but nobody really knows who Mrs. Redgrave is. So that's the mystery. So, what was Henry Herman's contribution to Philippine broadcasting? Basically, Henry Herman is the owner of the first commercial radio station here in the Philippines using 50-watt transmitters also in 1922. Herman owned the electrical supply company in Manila, and he set up 3 experimental AM radio stations, 2 in Manila and 1 in Pasay. In 1926, Herman consolidated the stations into a 100-watt AM station under the call letters KZKZ after the Americans' call letters. Okay. He also put up the first broadcast network in the country, Radio Corporation of the Philippines, RCP. In 1929, RCP established KZRC or KZ Radio Cebu. So it was Henry Herman who first owned and operated radio stations here in the Philippines. So because of course being radio stations owned by an American, much of the programming was patterned after American broadcasting. Okay? And also, since the receivers are owned by American expatriates or Americans who live here in the Philippines, they are the ones who can afford or who brought their radio receivers from the US here in the Philippines. So they need content or they need to uh, listen to radio programs. So of course, the radio programs will be tailored to American tastes. And then came the father of Philippine broadcasting. So this man uh, is Francisco Coco Trinidad. Okay, a Filipino broadcast pioneer, teacher, author, and actor. In the late 1920s, Trinidad was an announcer in Far Eastern Radio, a producer announcer for U.S. Office of War Information, and program director of the U.S. Information Service from 1945 to 1947. Okay? So he was the first Filipino who actually pioneered um, radio performances, radio announcing. So it was again being run by Americans, and the programs and the people in those radio stations were run by Americans as well. He was the first Filipino to be there. Again, Mr. Francisco Coco Trinidad. In 1970, Trinidad was the general manager of Philippine Broadcast Service or PBS. He was the one who negotiated with the International Telecommunications Union or ITU to change the American radio call sign from KZ to RP, so for Republic of the Philippines. But unfortunately, it was not approved, but he was the one who pioneered the discussion that we, as Filipinos or here in the Philippines, we need our own call signs for radio stations. Okay? So in 1947, the ITU instead granted to change K to D, which was originally assigned to Germany. So from the D, we still use or carry the D as a call sign today. DZJV or DWRR. Diba? So for Filipino radio stations, we still use the D for a call sign. So a little bit of trivia. The reason why it was taken from Germany and assigned to us by the ITU is because during the time Germany was using the radio stations or radio for propaganda, and of course ITU being controlled by the Americans faulted or gave or took away the D call sign from Germany as punishment and gave it to us Filipinos. Okay. Now, before World War II, commercial radio stations, mostly owned by the Americans, were operating in the country. So these are the three radio stations. You have KZRM, Radio Manila of RCP. You have KZRC, and you have KZIB. That's during the time before World War II. Okay. Now, the features of radio broadcasting during the American period. So, of course, again, ownership was dominated by the Americans. So, the programs were in English. Now, radio talents were famous. So, they call it the star system, where radio talents or the shows were primarily identified with a radio talent. Let's say, morning show with Sir Bart Mendoza. So they really identify who was the radio talent or the star system during the time. Okay, radio stations were mostly owned by department stores to advertise their products. So it's primarily used for advertising. Of course, music and radio dramas were played, but basically those are pre-recorded radio dramas or radio programs from the US. So they just bring the tapes here in the Philippines and then they broadcast it using the radio stations. Okay. Creation of regulatory bodies and agencies were done, of course, by the Americans as well. So in a way, media monopoly is happening because the Americans mostly own the radio stations. Okay. Cross ownership meaning one American can actually sell the radio station to another American. Okay, or in some instance, you have you have a radio station that is owned by two people or two companies. Okay, and basically, when it evolved and it became more and more popular and more accessible to the masses, then newspaper conglomerates actually bought up radio stations. So you have newspaper and broadcasting conglomerates. So um, hence it still became, even though the ownership transferred from the Americans to the Filipinos, it became controlled by certain media conglomerates, in turn controlled by certain families. Okay. Of course, it changed during the World War II or the Second World War when the Japanese occupied the Philippines from 1942 to 1946. Okay. During the time, all radio stations were closed except for KZRH, which was renamed PIAM. Radio receivers were reconditioned to prevent them from receiving broadcasts from America, and media was strictly under Japanese control, of course, and democratic rights were suspended. So basically radio, the PIAM was used to broadcast information and propaganda that forwards the Japanese objectives during the time. Okay. Now there's DZRH or KZRH during then. Okay, RH stands for Radio Heacock, after its original owner, H.E. Heacock, who owns the chain of department stores in America. Okay, during World War II, KZRH broadcasted the Voice of Freedom. which is transmitted hidden in the Malinta Tunnel in Corregidor. So this was the guerrilla radio station that was operated by the Americans, but was also basically the Filipinos helped run this particular radio program, the Voice of Freedom. Although there are although Americans are the primary audiences then, but Filipinos, okay, had a taste of radio during this time. Uh, Basically, the program that they listen to is still the Voice of Freedom. So generally, this particular program stated that Filipinos or soldiers keep on fighting because the Americans will come and rescue them. So just hold the fort, so to speak. Okay. In radio, Lieutenant Norman Reyes broadcasted the fall of Bataan in 1942. So I quote, Bataan has fallen, but the spirit that made it stand, a beacon to all liberty-loving people of the world, cannot fall. So this was the last line uh, of Lieutenant Norman Reyes during the fall of Bataan. Okay. So, of course, after after the Second World War, so radio broadcasting uh, still existed. Okay. So, post-war, so an unprecedented growth of radio in the country. Okay. In 1947, the first call letters were changed from K to D. So, ito na nga. So, naging D. So, DZ was assigned to Luzon, DY to Visayas, and DX to Mindanao radio stations. In 1945, from 8 radio stations to 22 radio stations were established. So radio became the primary medium of entertainment after World War II. So radio became a profitable business, and by the 1950s, they coined it the golden age of radio. Okay? So the golden age of radio came about because of the introduction of the transistor radio. So again, music recording and recordings of different program formats like drama, news and public affairs. And also during the 1950s, the use of Tagalog and regional languages came about in programming. Okay? During the 1950s to the 1970s, radio was instrumental to the promotion of long-distance education for agricultural and rural development. Okay? Hence the term farmcasting. Okay, so radio really became part of development communication during the 1950s to the 1970s. Okay, now, okay, even though we have television and of course we have our new baby in terms of technology medium, the internet, okay, radio still remains a very popular medium for communication. Say, maybe you don't really notice, but still radio careers in radio industries are still very viable for communication students. Okay? Radio operations, being radio personalities or being radio content creators are still a good career to choose for communication graduates. And there are a lot of communication graduates that are very successful in radio. Also, radio now not just utilizes again broadcast literal or analog broadcast anymore. Radio can now be utilized or can now be accessed using the internet also. Okay, so that ends my lecture on the history of Philippine radio or radio in the Philippines. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you.